Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ideological Fixation, From the Stone Age to Today's Culture Wars, by Azar Gat, narrated by Shawn K. Jain. Preface. I began writing this book before the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, before the terms fake news and alternative facts were coined, and before the further, ever-continuing escalation of America's ideological civil war. What prompted the book was not any particular political development, but, as all intellectual ventures should ideally be, a deep sense of wonderment. Wonderment at the way people tend to be wholly enclosed within their ideological frames, and entirely deaf, indeed react with total rejection and hostility, to arguments and claims about the world that come from the opposite camp, no matter how valid they might be. Ideology consists of cherished normative prescriptions as to what is just and how social reality should accordingly be shaped, together with an interpretive roadmap indicating how these normative prescriptions can be implemented in the real world. Ideological fixation is the result of the ever-present tensions and conflicts between our normative wishes and interpretation of reality. I have always been intrigued by this phenomenon, and by the built-in biases and gross errors in the understanding of reality it breeds. I am an Israeli, a citizen of a country that since its inception has experienced profound existential concerns and ideological divides. More remarkably, after social theorists around 1960 proclaimed the death of ideology, ideological divides and clashes have re-emerged with renewed intensity throughout the world. Currently, they include not only the challenges to liberal democracy presented by illiberal and non-democratic China and Russia, or by fundamentalist and jihadist Islam, but also deep cleavages and all-pervasive antagonisms in the liberal democracies themselves. In the United States, they have become particularly acute and venomous. The zeal of the opposing sides is often scarcely less than that which characterized the religious ideologies of old, or that which prevailed between the great rival ideologies of the 19th and 20th centuries, liberalism, socialism, and fascism. The other side is widely viewed as malicious, irrational, or downright stupid, and often as barely legitimate. People are strongly predisposed to regard their own camp as both patently right and righteous, while viewing the other side as malevolent and willfully wrong. In my experience, the prospects of bringing even the best and the brightest, particularly the best and the brightest, on either side of an ideological divide to critically examine their camp's dogmas, or consider the possibility of even a partial validity of some of the other side's arguments, are very slim indeed. That those who express the opposite claims are identified with the other side is enough to close ears and minds. In this dialogue of the deaf, the arguments simply do not register and are received with a mixture of contempt and rage. Ideologies, and hence ideological clashes, antagonism, and fixations, are as old as civilization itself. During most of history, ideologies were mainly religious, whereas during modern times they have taken the form often described as secular religions, or religion substitutes. They have always served to legitimize socioeconomic and political orders, or have projected alternatives to them. The ideological mode of interpreting and relating to the world, as well as ideological fixations, seem to be intrinsic features of the human mind. In his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, 2011, psychologist Daniel Kahneman has suggested that the human mind has two basic systems of operation. The first and more common relying on simple cues and heuristics used to arrive at split-second decisions. The second, far slower and more deliberate, is occasionally resorted to when a more systematic analysis of complex problems is called for. The ideological mode of thinking may belong to a third category. It involves highly complex interpretations of and emotional behavioral reactions to the world, for which we rely on ready-made and deeply internalized templates to produce instant, reflex-like attitudes and propositions. This book is not a survey of past and present ideologies. There are many such excellent surveys on the market. Instead, it is an attempt to understand the cognitive, emotional, and social roots of the ideological phenomenon, why we are so prone to, indeed are captive of, the ideological mode of thinking. To find the answer to this riddle, the book combines insights from evolutionary theory regarding the nature of some of our deepest proclivities with a sweep through the great drama of history, from the Stone Age to the rise of civilization to the present. Ideology has been the subject of prodigious study over the past century or so. Scholars and publicists have emphasized both ideology's indispensable role as a compass guiding large-scale action and the application of social visions in the public arena, and built-in biases and dogmatic, zealous rigidity in the interpretation of reality. We hope to take the inquiry of both these aspects a step further, reversing Marx's famous saying, himself both a pioneering theorist and victim of ideological fixation, "I have little faith in the ability to change this deep human propensity. My aim is to understand it." In the first part of the book, we lay the groundwork by undertaking to decipher first what truth is. Does this concept have a meaning, or is everybody equally entitled to his or her facts? And second, how are we to understand morality, our vivid and deeply emotive normative coloring of the social world? Both questions have been the source of profound confusion, resurfacing with great public fanfare in the intellectual discourse of the last decades. I think you may learn from and enjoy this part a lot. However, if you are less interested in these profound questions that have preoccupied both philosophers and ordinary people throughout the ages, you can safely skip these preliminaries and jump right to the second and third parts of the book, and into the great ideological divides and fixations of the past and present. Part 1. Groundwork. 1. What is true? Though never the whole truth. When I originally wrote this chapter, the phrase alternative facts did not yet exist. However, the questions underlying it, what is true, is there truth, are among the most profound questions that have preoccupied humanity since the dawn of civilization. The nature of truth needs to be clarified prior to any discussion of ideology, ideological differences, and ideological fixation. In this opening chapter, we argue that while the skeptical tradition concerning the existence of truth, from antiquity to present-day postmodernists, has a point, and a highly significant one, this point has been vastly overdrawn. Truth about reality, properly understood, is a very meaningful notion, and not everything is equally true, or true at all. We begin with some elementary and familiar stuff, at least to those with a little knowledge of the history of thought. So the more informed listeners are asked to exercise some patience as we progress in this chapter from the basic to the more advanced. In a very deep sense, we live in a world of our own making. The world that exists in our mind is largely a product of that mind. This is the conclusion reached by millennia of philosophical reflection and centuries of modern scientific discovery. Thus, people see only a limited section of the spectrum of colors, from red to violet, and are blind to anything on the infrared and ultraviolet spectra. Our hearing is similarly restricted to a limited tonal range on the spectrum of vibrations, roughly between 20 Hz and 20 kHz. Moreover, color and sound themselves are regarded within our current understanding of the world as mental renderings that exist only in the mind, of physical properties of the world, waves, particles, that impact our sense organs. The 17th century philosopher John Locke called such mental representations of reality, which also include products of our other senses such as smell, taste, touch, and heat chill, secondary qualities. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound or only create vibrations? Much the same applies to objects' physical extension and solidity. Locke's primary qualities that supposedly belong directly to the objects themselves, irrespective of our sense perception. We inhabit a perceived world of solid objects of roughly our own size range, and become aware of the infinitesimal world of elementary particles and the vast spaces that separate them, as well as of the imperceptible size of the universe beyond the observable heavens, only by means of instruments that extend our senses' reach and by inferences beyond sense perceptions. Different organisms have different senses and sense perceptions, tuned to the different physical features that constitute their relationship with their environment. Hence, they experience different images of the world. Selecting an especially alien example, philosopher Thomas Nagel has illustrated this point in an article that stimulates the imagination. What is it like to be a bat? The ancient Greeks, who almost miraculously raised all the big questions that would preoccupy humanity through the ages, made pretty much the same point millennia ago. The Greek school of skeptics, confounded by the elusiveness of our sense perceptions and the limitations of our concepts, cited as examples the differences in their inner experience between men and a variety of more or less alien creatures, from frogs to bees to shellfish. If our perception of the outside world turns out upon reflection to be different from the transparent one-to-one mirror that we instinctively feel it is, what then is the relationship between reality and our mental representations of it? What part of the picture of the world that we carry in our heads comes from reality itself, and what part is contributed by our own sense organs and mental processes? How can we separate the two, the objective from the subjective, and tell what the world is really like? Aristotle defined error and truth in the following commonsensical way. To say of what is that it is not, or what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that is true. Plato had articulated a similar definition. This is known as the correspondence theory of truth, a correspondence between our ideas and realities in the world. But in what way do ideas, which are mental phenomena in the mind, correspond to real things outside? What barriers exist between the two, and what kind of bridges allow us to cross between them? Each of these questions has turned out to be a monumental puzzle, and the subject of intense contemplation from the ancient Greeks on, as well as outside the Western tradition to the present. We shall touch on some of the main points in this intellectual journey as succinctly as possible. First, how do we know that the image of the world in our mind actually represents a reality outside? In dreams, we get along pretty well in an imagined reality. Maybe our lives are similarly just a dreamlike illusion. Plato thought that the connection between the world of our senses and reality is so distorted that we are like people eternally locked in a cave, with only faint shadows of reality projected on the wall opposite them. From antiquity on, some Buddhist schools have taught that reality is an illusion, something like a big dream. In the 17th century, René Descartes, setting in motion the train of modern philosophy, focused his search for secure knowledge of the world on this fundamental problem. He concluded that God, whose existence he thought he had proved a step earlier, would not conceivably play such a dirty trick as to deceive people that they lived in a real world rather than in a dream. Unfortunately, we tend to regard both the existence and benevolence of God as less straightforward than did Descartes. Indeed, in the early 18th century, philosopher George Berkeley, an Anglican bishop, evidently viewed God's work very differently from Descartes. He argued that there was no material reality, and that the world actually existed only as ideas in the minds, a view known as idealism. In his Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, philosopher Immanuel Kant conceded that we could not really know the world in itself, beyond what our senses and perceptual tools presented to us. He consoled himself with the view that knowledge and certainty are at least secured in the world of phenomena as experienced in our mind, precisely by virtue of the fixed features of the mind's sensual and perceptual apparatus that imprint all experience. This line of thought has been taken up by the philosophical school known as phenomenalism from the late 19th century on. After all, there appears to be no conceivable way that we can step outside ourselves to check what reality is beyond our inner world of sense perceptions. Ordinarily, we find doubts regarding the reality of the world futile. In the 18th century, Dr. Samuel Johnson, famous among other things for his wittiness and common-sense wisdom, responded to Berkeley's denial of the existence of a material world by vigorously kicking a stone, saying, "I refute it thus. Our world seems very real and solid to us, most of the time. But how can we tell for sure? Who has not felt sometimes that the reality we live in is elusive and perhaps deceptive? The hugely successful Hollywood movie The Matrix, 1999, which portrays a simulated world created by artificial intelligence to deceive the people who are locked in it, has become an often invoked metaphor, a modern equivalent of Descartes' problem, Plato's cave, and the Buddhist world as an illusion. Thus, the often made claim, amusingly illustrated by Dr. Johnson, that nobody truly believes, let alone actually acts on the belief, that the outside world is not real, may be generally correct, and yet it is not a refutation of the skeptic's fundamental doubt, because it is precisely the vividness and cage-like nature of the world as a possible illusion that is the issue. Common sense and our immediate sense perception are no help either, because even seemingly self-evident sense perceptions, such as the apparent flatness of the earth, the movement of the sun around it, and indeed colors, turn out to involve perceptual illusions of some sort. On the other hand, empirically well-supported scientific theories can be so counterintuitive and non-commonsensical as to cause Albert Einstein, whose own relativity theory is far from intuitive, to rebel against the implications of quantum mechanics, despite its huge predictive success. Nor do the amazing achievements of science and technology constitute, in and of themselves, a refutation of the skeptic position, as they too apply to the world of phenomena that we perceive, the world as it appears to us. The laws of nature themselves may be part of a dreamlike illusion of an outside world. Thus, as almost everybody who has concerned himself with this problem agrees, it is not possible to refute the skeptical doubt regarding the foundations of our entire picture of the world. In a strict sense, the overwhelming majority of humanity holding that the world outside us actually exists, a view known as realism, assumes or believes this proposition because, given the world's concreteness in our mind and our existential need to live and survive in it, it is more natural, and it appears more plausible to take that position where no substantial evidence for the opposite view exists. The formal systems of logic and mathematics enjoy a higher level of certainty only because they are taken to reflect forms of the mind rather than beings in the world. Therefore, contra Descartes, our knowledge of the world rests from its very foundations, not on certainties, but on assumptions or beliefs that seem more plausible given the other elements of our worldview. The same applies at every stage up the edifice of our knowledge, as more and more assumptions are added, based on the same criteria. Indeed, the problem of reality and of our comprehension of it concerns not only the actual existence and nature of the world, but also the status of every individual statement about it. The intrinsic interdependence of the various elements of our worldview was first pointed out by the Greek skeptics. It puzzled them because it suggested that there were no foundational, self-evident facts on which everything else we think we know about the world could be securely based. This may be taken to mean that human knowledge is arbitrary, circular, and relative, as to some degree it is. In the spirit of Greek philosophy in which the Roman elite were schooled, Pontius Pilate sophisticatedly responded to Jesus' profession of truth with the words, "What is truth?" John chapter 18, verse 38. And the Roman philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote skeptically, albeit less cynically, "Remember that all is opinion." The view that our knowledge of the world is not certain in any absolute sense has become commonplace from the second half of the 20th century. Some of the period's most influential analytical philosophers, such as Willard Quine, Wilfrid Sellars, Donald Davidson, and Hilary Putnam, incorporating older philosophical traditions, have argued that our picture of the world is based on beliefs that are judged more plausible given the weight of the evidence and all the other interrelated elements of our worldview, a view known as holism. These include the best methods of observation and more persuasive explanatory theories available at the time. This conceptual framework involves a more conditional, tentative, and fluid understanding of what should qualify as true given the intrinsic limitations of the connection between mind and reality. I share this view. Indeed, I held it before I ever heard the names of any of these philosophers, and wish to develop it, generally and as concerns social and historical realities. Framing and tagging, concepts and conceptual grids. We comprehend the world through a grid of concepts that relate to each other. The terms scheme, web, net, cluster, and fabric have all been interchangeably used. This means that we issue a label, a code symbol, for any feature of the world that is of interest to us. We tag it, attach a signifier to something that is signified, in the terminology of pioneering linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. The tagged features often do not fully overlap in different conceptual grids, and they obviously have different names, words, in different languages, which also use somewhat different syntactical rules to arrange and manipulate them. But the cognitive mechanism involved is basically the same. We are able to issue any number of such labels to tag features of the world in greater detail, or to cover new features that have come to attract our attention. We group concepts that we find similar in some ways into more general concepts, coin abstract concepts that do not seem to have obvious tangible objects in reality, such as capitalism, government, or Christianity, and for various purposes invent imagined concepts that may or may not exist. We combine concepts into meaningful narratives woven into our conceptual grids, and we are able to imagine actual and potential scenarios, past and future. This is an amazing mental process, responsible for humankind's exceptional cognitive capabilities and ability to deal with the world. It is also very natural and intuitive to us, so we do not easily comprehend what the process entails or its limitations. Consider ostensibly simple concepts, such as a tree or a chicken. Their meaning and, moreover, their tangibility are very obvious to us, and they are also to animals. Yet not one tree, even from the same species, is identical to any other tree, nor is any particular tree similar to what it was a moment ago, or to what it will be in the next moment. The same applies to chickens, and to all other ostensibly simple concepts. Realizing that everything flows and nothing stays, the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously stated that you could not step twice into the same river. Furthermore, on what grounds do we distinguish between the group of atoms and molecules that we identify as a tree from those that we call soil, air, water, or moss surrounding it, each of which is also an ostensibly simple concept that actually covers great internal diversity? Moreover, how do we distinguish them from the entirety and continuum of being? As holistic philosophers have argued, all our concepts of objects are only partial abstractions, extracted from their innumerable deep connections with the rest of the universe. Indeed, many of the questions that we have seen with respect to objects extend to what we perceive as actions and other connections and relationships between objects. We focus on, and in this way isolate, particular connections that we perceive as causation and other relationships that are of interest to us. But as the Greek skeptics long noted, in this process we do not notice, or we set aside, the innumerable connections and interactions existing between the things that are irrelevant to our particular interest or perspective at a given moment or ever. This is despite the fact that ultimately everything is supposedly connected to everything else in infinite ways. The realization of these sorts of puzzles drove the Greek philosopher Cratylus to a desperate conclusion, which he allegedly adopted in practice. He felt that given the unresolvable limitations of our conceptual tools and comprehension of the world, one best serves the truth by keeping silence and not uttering a word, as any speech is necessarily inaccurate and incomplete and therefore distorts reality. We find Cratylus' plight and existential decision amusing, not only because we do not ordinarily pay much attention to the constraints of our strongly intuitive system of concepts, but also, or mainly, because we give practical life and the needs of human communication a vastly greater priority over the idealistic quest for an unattainable absolute accuracy and comprehensiveness. Furthermore, in a more reflective mode, we look at the full half of the glass and are in awe at the magical stuff that fills it and serves us so amazingly in comprehending and coping with the world. Rather than keeping silent, we may better serve our understanding of what is truth by paying the closest attention to how our cognitive and conceptual systems work. Assuming that the world outside us does exist, and that we need to live and survive in it, it is not possible for our necessarily finite cognitive system to comprehend reality in its entirety or totality. Such an ability was traditionally reserved to God in the Western tradition, and has survived in some strands of metaphysics, in what philosopher Hilary Putnam, echoing Friedrich Nietzsche's famous Death of God, has called, and dismissed as, God's eye of the world. As already mentioned, in the absence of infinite comprehension, we use an ingenious shortcut by focusing on and conceptualizing features of reality, objects, actions, connections, and relationships that best serve our more general or momentary needs and interests. Our conceptual tagging system functions as a shorthand or translation code that converts the infinity of the world into finite concepts and conceptual grids. Every ostensibly simple concept, such as a tree or a chicken, despite its concreteness in our minds, is actually a general concept that singles out, frames together, and tags a group of features on the basis some family resemblance that we see between them. The term family resemblance was coined by 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. In his early work Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, he championed the view that there were elementary observable facts out there that could be captured by picture concepts in the mind on a one-to-one basis, if only we rigorously adhere to a clear and coherent symbolic linguistic system. However, Wittgenstein later changed his mind completely. He spent the rest of his life developing the view, presented in his posthumous Philosophical Investigations, 1953, that our conceptual linguistic terms were constructs created to cope with the world and communicate with other people in the service of life's many and diverse practical needs, functions, and purposes. He called this variety of uses and modes of expression language games. His concept of family resemblance, the basis for the grouping together of items into general concepts or categories, is widely cited, but needs some further exploration. By its very nature, family resemblance is, partly, in the eye of the beholder, while, however, being established on the basis of some meaningful criteria. In some cases, the chosen resemblance can actually be reduced to the molecular level. No piece of flint is identical with any other, or is not alloyed, but they are more similar to one another than to non-flints. They form a close cluster in terms of their physical traits. Sometimes an organic element is added. No pine is identical to any other pine, but pines are closer to each other on the molecular level than to any non-pine. And this resemblance, which extends to the molecules of the pine's genome, guarantees that pines will produce only pines, and will be produced from pines only. We noticed these facts long before we knew anything about molecules or genes. Moreover, a pine constitutes a biological system in which the parts are bound together by functional interdependence. The same applies to chickens, with an added twist. The combination of features that constitute chickens as separate from their environment.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?